Joining us now, our Squawk newsmaker of the morning, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. Mr. Treasury Secretary, it's great to have you on today. And the first question I was going to ask you was who's going to lead the negotiations. Peter Navarro just said that it's going to be Lighthizer, and we put that out because it was a wire. Can he speak for, can you confirm that? Is it going to be Mr. Lighthizer for the next 90 days leading things?
Well, good morning. First of all, it's great to be here with you. I think it's clear that President Trump is going to be the one who leads the negotiations, and the team will be an inclusive team. It's been a partnership of myself, Ambassador Lighthizer, Larry Kudlow from the White House, Wilbur Ross, and Peter. So this will be a team that is very inclusive. And we also have people from agriculture and energy. So there's a lot of work to do. This will be a real agreement. I think one of the things was very important is there was very specific understanding between President Trump and President Xi. And now it's the team's job to turn this into a real agreement that will have deliverables, dates, and real commitments.
One of the things that a lot of the articles are pointing out, Mr. Treasury Secretary, was there really was a change in tone, because leading up to the meeting, a lot of our officials, you and others, had been very critical of China. And China, in the same way, pushing back on whether anything would really change. Was there a tangible difference in the tone that you could pick up at the dinner?
I think so. You know, we had several meetings in advance of the dinner, but the final agreement was clearly an agreement between the two leaders, and there were no decisions made until the two leaders met. But this is the first time that we have a commitment from them that this will be a real agreement. There'll be structural issues. There'll be non-structural issues. There'll be issues on intellectual property, IP, technology, cyber, currency. And we're very clear in that we got a lot of work to do over the next 90 days to now document this.
Here's another, and I'm just happen to be looking at the journal. Everybody's writing a bunch of conjecture, obviously. But as far as China opening up its markets more to us, the point is made that in the past, talk is cheap. And they've always said, yeah, we'll do that. But they've never lived up on it. The journal lived up to it. The journal says this time around, China is willing to consider putting in place a mechanism to measure progress in opening up its markets to us. What does that look like? And are you really confident that this time they'd follow through? And I mean, it would be a trust but verify type situation again.
Well, let me just say I'm very hopeful we can turn this into a real agreement. The president has made very clear that there's a pause, but if we don't have a real agreement, the tariffs will increase, and he can always contemplate more. But there was clearly a very genuine offer from President Xi to President Trump to make sure that they opened up their markets to U.S. companies. This will be the biggest single opportunity for economic growth for U.S. companies and U.S. workers. So I think this is a big difference.
I think the president, I heard that the offer for buying farm products was received very well by him. In fact, he's just tweeting about that. I don't know if you saw this, Mr. Secretary. Probably not. It was 4 minutes ago. Farmers will be a very big and fast beneficiary of our deal with China. They intend to start purchasing agricultural product immediately. We make the finest and cleanest product in the world, and that is what China wants. Farmers, I love you. Did we not know that was that actually a surprise when President Xi offered that up? And how do we measure if the Chinese follow through on that?
Well, as President Trump said, the overall number still needs to be negotiated. But clearly, things like agriculture are going to start immediately. They have a lot of demand for agriculture. Energy is a very important part. We got to build a lot of LNG capabilities in terms of infrastructure, but there's going to be big long-term commitments on LNG. We specifically talked about the Alaska project, which has over 200 years supply. We talked about industrial products, automobiles. I mean, they put on the table an offer of over $1.2 trillion in additional commitments, but the details of that still need to be negotiated. But these are big numbers. But I want to emphasize, this isn't just about buying things. This is about opening up markets to U.S. companies and protecting U.S. technology. Those are very important structural issues to the president.
Mr. Secretary, those structural issues are ones that you've mentioned every time you've come on our program, and it's certainly something a lot of U.S. businesses are very concerned about. In 90 days, that seems an awful lot to lift and a lot of ground to cover and try and figure out what's going on. We've already heard from a few people this morning who are suggesting that in 90 days, it's not likely to have any agreement on those issues, and the Chinese would look for an extension of the trade truce and no new tariffs to be coming on. What happens in 90 days if we don't have a firm commitment on some of those issues you just mentioned?
Well, I think President Trump was very clear. We need to have real progress over these 90 days, and there needs to be a real commitment. Now, you're right. There are over 142 different issues that we're focused on. So every single one may not be finalized in the first phase, but that'll be up to President Trump to determine. But he expects there's going to be real progress. And I think we'll know very soon whether we have an overall agreement that we can document. Again, this was a commitment between the two presidents. Let me just add two other very important issues. China agreed to make a significant change on classifying fentanyl. That was very important to President Trump. That is going to be an enormous lifesaver in the United States. I think you know how concerned President Trump is on fentanyl. And as important, the commitment on North Korea. There is a very strong commitment between the two presidents to work together to make sure that we have a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. And I think, as you know, I've been actively involved in the sanctions. So this is something that's very important, and Secretary Pompeo has done an amazing job leading this effort.
That's great. We can talk more about that. But just again, back to this idea of if we don't have concrete progress on some of those very tough issues to try and tackle, would we see an extension at that point if we feel like we've made progress? And then how do you protect against the idea that some people have suggested, which is that the Chinese love to talk, they never follow up with these things, and their game plan would be great if they could just get these talks to continue endlessly? Is there an outdate that you look at and you think we need to have something concrete by this time?
We absolutely need to have something concrete over these 90 days. And there was a very significant commitment from both leaders on what needs to be done over the 90 days and instructions to both teams to negotiate and turn this into a real agreement with specific action items, deliverables, and timeframes. This is not going to be something where there's just soft commitments that get kicked down the road. But again, I want to emphasize, this was the first time I've seen the two leaders have very, very specific discussions. We had a dinner for close to 3 hours on this. President Trump personally dictated the statement afterwards. And we will be reporting to him weekly on the progress, if not daily.
Mr. Secretary, Tom Farley, great to be with you again. I was just telling our co-host at the break that it was long overdue. We took a tough stance on China, High Wire Act, but feels like you're doing a really great job. Thank you. I want to ask a question that I've been wondering, sitting at home. You know, the market's up 500 points today. If there was no progress over the weekend, it may have been down 1,000 points. You're a markets person. You grew up around markets. Your father is a markets luminary. Are you sitting there before you have that dinner thinking to yourself, hey, markets could get really haywire, or markets could really increase, whether it's the S&P or the Dow? Does that factor into your thinking because it's such a visible scorecard?
I think what factors really into our thinking is economic growth, and we've been very clear, and a major priority of this administration is to create economic growth of 3% or higher. And that's always been a combination of what was tax reform, tax cuts, regulatory changes in trade. Trade's always been a big component of this. And, you know, look, there's a lot of volatility. I would say one of the big differences is today is because of electronic trading and the Volcker rule where people can't principal things. Tom, as you know, you get more volatility in both directions. But we are focused on creating great opportunities for U.S. companies and U.S. workers. And we're absolutely conscious if we get this right, this is a big increase in growth in the United States, jobs in the United States, exports. I mean, this is the first time I could see a clear path of shrinking this trade deficit to zero over a strategic time period that's real.
Mr. Secretary, has the president ever expressed any dissatisfaction about your recommendation of Jay Powell to be Fed chairman directly to you? Have you heard? And I know you saw some of the conjecture in the past couple of weeks about that. Is it did he mention it directly to you? Did you hear about it? Is there any veracity to any of the reports?
I think, I'm always going to be careful about private conversations between the president and myself. But I think, as I've said before, I've known the president for over 15 years. I traveled with him for a year on the campaign. Of course, there's issues we agree on. There's issues we don't agree on. I tell him what I think. And I respect that he is the president. He was elected. And these are his decisions. So I will continue to give the president my best advice. And I do think the president was pleased with the speech last week.
I was going to ask you that, whether, because I think before the speech it was, I can't think of a single, I don't remember the quote, something like, I can't think of a single thing I like about Powell. But then it was a speech. I wonder if now he says, well, I like that speech. He found something that he did like. So he was gratified by the speech that seemed to get a little more dovish last week.
I will tell you he liked the speech. And I would also just say, I think, as you know, Jay Powell's got a difficult job because he was left with a gigantic portfolio that was increased over $4 trillion in the previous administration that he's trying to right-size. We had interest rates at zero for way too long to try to help the Obama economy, and it didn't do much. And he was left with the hard work to try to normalize rates and stabilize a portfolio so that he has the firepower if the economy slows down to juice the economy.
There were reports last week, Mr. Secretary, that you had been asking people what they thought about the idea of reducing the balance sheet faster rather than raising interest rates. Any thoughts on what you've heard back on that or what you think?
I think it's unfortunate that in private conversations with a Treasury borrowing group that people repeat what I say. But I did ask them, because there's obviously two tools for monetary policy. One is the portfolio and one is short-term interest rates, and I did solicit views. As I solicit views on lots of things, the whole purpose of the Treasury Borrowing Committee is to give feedback to the Treasury, and they do a terrific job. But I think it's unfortunate that people feel compelled to walk out of rooms in private conversations and speak to the press.
Yep. There has also been... Don't you love the way people write things, Mr. Treasury Secretary? It does give us something to talk about, though, that the president sort of gauges the stock market as a report card on how he's doing as president. So he doesn't like it when it goes down. Do you, at some point, actually have to hear from him that what the heck are you doing? The stock market's going down. Does he blame you when the market doesn't go up? Have you heard anything like that? I read that happened.
Well, let me just say that's absolutely not the case, okay? I speak to the president almost every day. We speak on lots of issues. The president completely understands. He was a great businessman before he came into office. He's the first president that really understands these business issues. And of course he understands their stock market volatility. Now, the fact that the market is up so much since the election is a credit to the economic plan that we've put in place. But of course the president understands the market goes up 1,000, the market goes down 1,000. We do want to create great opportunities for U.S. companies and U.S. workers, and that's what we've been doing and will continue to do.
We've also heard he views some of the gains in the market not as necessarily as house money, but maybe this is the time to deal with some of the trade inequities, whether it's China or Europe or wherever, that we have some leeway given how well the markets have done. Do you think that is in the back of his mind, that he thinks there is house money to play with in terms of addressing some of these global issues now that the market's up so much?
I want to assure you the president has been determined from day one of the campaign to deal with these issues. I think, as you know, on the China issue, he's been talking about this way before he ran for president. And this is a major issue for him. And again, I think this was a breakthrough moment for the two presidents reaching this agreement. So the president is not concerned on where the stock market is on any one given day and isn't going to be focused on that. Although I will tell you he does watch the stock market. But the president is determined to continue to move forward on our economic path. And I think this was a great breakthrough. And now the two teams have a lot of work to turn this into a real agreement.
Mr. Secretary, when we look at the list of open items to negotiate with China, it's extensive, and it's going to take longer than 3 months. Tech transfers, market access, the goods that are purchased, so on and so forth. Is there a sense that we're going to see within 3 months if China is really, truly coming to the table, actively negotiating on these issues, and then we can kind of kick the can, we could extend it another 3 months, maybe another 3 months? Is that how you're thinking about it? Or is it more holistic, which is to say we want to see a Herculean movement in the next 3 months? We want to see near complete negotiation of all these items, or else we're going to go back to our prior negotiating strategy?
I see it a little bit differently. We've been working on this for the last year and a half. I think there's no question that the president's tariff strategy has worked, that this is a major change in a proposal from China. This is the first time they've responded on very, very specific issues. So I think the fact that we're back at the table, and more importantly, is the first time we've had an agreement between the two presidents. It was very specific. This was a 3-hour dinner that went through very, very specific issues that are agreed, and now it's our turn to turn it into a document on the two teams. Now, again, there could be a phased-in approach. So this is not about kicking the can down the road, but there are certain issues that they can deliver in the short term. There are certain issues that may take a little bit longer to kick in, and the president will deal with the tariffs accordingly. So all he's done at the moment is put a hold on increasing tariffs. He has all the tools in the toolbox. But again, I would just emphasize this was a huge difference from anything I've seen over the last year and a half in terms of a commitment between the two presidents.
Mr. Secretary, you mentioned earlier the various elements of the administration's economic program, right? Tax reform, deregulation, and of course trade as being a component of it. Going into 2019, is trade the principal one right now? Because obviously there's a little bit less talk of, tax cuts 2.0. What else is there on the economic agenda from your perspective?
Well, let me just start on taxes. So although we passed tax reform, I think, at the Treasury, we're in the process of churning out, over 80 different regulations and giving people specific guidance. So things like opportunity zones, which are a very big part of the Tax Act, I think they're going to kick in a big way next year. I think that a lot of companies have continued to wait to look for specific regulations to get clear guidance. So I think you're going to see capital investment continue to pick up next year on the tax front. Regulatory relief, we're going to continue to work, I can tell you, on the financial front with the regulators. And I know my other partners in the cabinet will continue to work on issues. I think energy is an enormous opportunity of growth in the U.S. economy. I think the fact that we just signed the deal with Mexico and Canada, and you heard the president being very determined that this deal will get passed or he's going to terminate the old agreement. So I expect this will quickly be passed in the new Congress. So trade, we have our work out, but we continue to negotiate with Europe. Ambassador Lighthizer is leading discussions with Japan. One of the major issues that was discussed at the G20 and there was an agreement on is WTO reform. That's something that Ambassador Lighthizer is going to be leading. So we are determined to make sure that there is free and fair reciprocal trade with rules that are enforced.
Mr. Secretary, we have another tweet. I just want to ask you something quickly, though. There was conjecture, Peter Navarro was going to be at the dinner. He's not going to be at the dinner. He was at the dinner. But was he vocal? Did he say anything? Is his point of view less out in front than it had been at points in the past, in your view?
I think this has been a bit exaggerated. The internal politics. Of course, we have a diverse economic team. Peter is an important part of that team. He's been an important part since the campaign. Peter came to China with us. Peter came on this trip with us. He was in every single meeting we had with the president on Air Force One and in the president's hotel suite. So, of course, different people have different points of views on specifics, and we all reflect that to the president. And at the end of the day, this is the president's decision. So I have a great picture of Peter and I, thumbs up on Air Force One. If I can find it from the professional photographer, I'll tweet it out for all of you.
Excellent. If you do that, I'll like it and retweet it. The president just said, and I just saw someone said he said, she said. I hadn't seen that.
Melissa Lee said that.
Yeah, Melissa Lee. Very clever. Anyway, but the president just tweeted again, President Xi and I have had a very strong and personal relationship. He and I are the only two people that can bring about massive and very positive change on trade and far beyond between our two great nations. A solution for North Korea is a great thing for China and all. We appreciate all your time today, Mr. Secretary. You're fielding all these questions. I guess I got to ask you, but whether you favor a weak dollar again at this point. Maybe you're not going to. Remember that one? That was the one that got you last time. I'm not going to ask you that.
I do remember that one, and I'm going to say no comment on the dollar. But thank you.
All right.
And thanks for giving me advice not to comment on it.
You want to talk about interest rates?
Yeah, we already talked about Powell.
But yeah, interest rates themselves, are they too high?
Yeah, that's a good one. That is an interesting perspective. I will ask you that. Do you think we're near neutral at this point? Maybe one more hike, and that would put us near neutral in what would be a big shift from the last 20 years on what a neutral interest rate would be.
Well, I won't comment on it specifically, but what I will say is what I think is very important that's coming out of the Fed, and this is from both Jay Powell as well as other Fed governors, is that they are data oriented, that they're not relying upon, super secret models and stars and things like that. They're going to react to numbers. So I think that Jay's comments, obviously, that we're close to neutral are important, but I also can tell you, I know they're looking at the data. So this is not like a previous Fed that just, has numbers that they're looking at and making decisions regardless. I know they're carefully looking at inflation. The inflation numbers have been quite attractive. The fact that oil prices have come down, I think, is very important in terms of inflation. So I know we'll all be looking forward to the December 18th meeting.
We're going to leave it there. We appreciate all of your time and your access, giving us access to all these different subjects, Mr. Treasury Secretary. Appreciate it today. I think it's a pretty interesting day for China and the United States. We're fingers crossed that something good happens for both countries from this. You never know.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
Okay. Thank you to Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin.